Welcome back. Last week, we finished our exploration of the Jewish life cycle, which followed our exploration of Jewish holidays. And now we're turning to other elements of Jewish culture. Specifically, we're going to start with looking at Jewish literature, written culture. And Jewish culture as a whole really privileges that side of human intelligence, the verbal, the writing, the reading, the speaking, the arguing. That is an elevated part of Jewish culture. We will see there are other aspects of Jewish culture like art and music that are there, of course. We are human after all, and we express ourselves as humans do culturally, but it also is less emphasized compared to the written word. After all, think about the creation story at the very beginning of Genesis. How does the creator God in chapter 1 create things? He speaks. Doesn't do anything with his hands. Let there be, and there is, and then it is declared to be good. So the power of the word goes back to that very early story, or we should say more appropriately historically, Jewish culture emphasized the word, and therefore they wrote the story emphasizing the word. You see, this is one of those conceptual shifts that you have when you think about the Torah from a humanistic perspective, or even just from a secular academic perspective. We have to think about the people who wrote it, and when, and why, and what were they trying to say, and not thinking of the text as pre-existing anything else. You know, Genesis chapter 1 is people's imagination of what might have happened at the beginning of the universe, but it isn't what actually happened at the beginning of the universe, at least from our perspective and based on the evidence that we have. So one of our challenges historically in humanistic Judaism has been, how do we deal with this Torah scroll? Because there's a danger of overemphasizing the Torah. First of all, you miss a whole lot of other Jewish literature that's really interesting in the rest of the Hebrew Bible, in the rest of Jewish culture for the 2,000 years since the Hebrew Bible canon was closed. But the other thing to keep in mind is that the traditional Jewish approach to the Torah was that this was not simply an important book by people. This was the most important book written directly by the God who created everything in the universe. And if the God who made everything gave you an instruction manual for life, you would read it, and you would read it again, and you would read it carefully, and you would read every small detail, because of course, if a God writes it, every little detail, even the shape of the letters, might have a lesson to teach you. In fact, there's a famous commentary on the very beginning of the Hebrew Bible. It says, why did the world begin with a bet, the Hebrew letter bet, which is the first letter of the word Bereshit, or in the beginning? And the answer was, because the bet is shaped sort of like this, so that you shouldn't look before it or above it or below it. You can only go this way. You can only look from that point forward. Don't ask who made God. Don't ask what happened before no, you can only go that using the shape of the bet, because of course God designed the Aleph bet. And so it was all part of the master. This isn't how we approach this. We don't see this as something that came down from above and we are the custodians of. It's something that people wrote, the Jewish people wrote, and we can have pride in that, but we're not going to read it over and over and over again, because there are some parts that are wonderful and there are some parts that are problematic and there are some parts that may be downright objectionable. And we shouldn't have to contort ourselves to make that agree with us. As we'll see, our values and what the Torah values may be more like a Venn diagram with some overlap, but not a simultaneous full circle. The other challenge we had was what to do with the scroll. After all, the Torah is not just a set of words, it's actually a physical form, an older technology of books. Today we use something called a Codex, which has individual sheets of paper glued or stapled together, or in this case, spiral bound by a printer. And it allows you to write on both sides. But in a scroll, you write on only one side. And so it takes up much more room to cover the same amount of space, even though the Hebrew alphabet is more efficient than English. So you have this scroll, these 5 books written onto one major scroll. What do we do with it? Do we use it, or should we simply read any Torah text we want from a book, or from a Kindle, or from whatever new technology comes to play? If we do have a Torah scroll, where would we put it? The Birmingham Temple, which was the first congregation for humanistic Judaism with a building, actually put their Torah scroll in the library, not in an ark, because they said it's written by people, so it belongs with the books that people wrote. Other congregations may take a different approach. What we do in my congregation, since we do have an Ark tradition in our community, is I put other books in the Ark with the Torah. So if we're doing a high holiday series and I'm reading poetry, but I'll put the book of poetry in the Ark and go and get it from the Ark as I would the Torah scroll. Again, to make the point, this is an important book. It's a book that we honor, but it's still a book, even if it's an old and important book. Now, what does the word Torah mean? It actually has many layers of meaning. Originally, the root for Torah means teaching. So in modern Hebrew, the word moreh or morah is a teacher. One of the first words kids learn when they go to school is to refer to their teacher as morah or moreh. If you say my teacher, it's mori. And so it has this root of teaching to it. But it also has the concept of law. In fact, you'll see in certain parts in the Torah itself, it will refer to the Torah of leprosy or the Torah of damaged property or it's a specific law of a specific topic. It doesn't have to be all of law. Now, as it began to be applied very early on in Jewish culture, certainly by the time it was compiled around the year 500 before the Common Era, it was referring to the 5 books of Moses, as they're called now, or the Pentateuch, which is just Latin for 5, right? Pente, 5. So the Pentateuch is the 5 books of Moses. The Torah, it's those first 5 books of the Hebrew Bible. I will mention as an aside that there is an offshoot Jewish community called the Samaritans, who split off from Jewish life around the same time, around 500, 550 BCE. They have a different Torah. They still call it a Torah, but it has 6 books. It's a hexateuch, not a Pentateuch. Theirs ends with Joshua instead of ending with Deuteronomy. And there's a whole complex historical side to that. I will also mention that I'm not going to get into too much detail on the history behind the composition of the Torah, because that's something we cover in our Jewish history class that we offered last year. And for those who are watching this on video, I'll put a link for that video in the comments. So in the description of the video, so you can go and check that out when this one's over, or even in the middle, it doesn't matter. I can't control what you click on. All right. So it has this meaning of the 5 books, but over time, certainly in rabbinic thought, it takes on even deeper meanings. It begins to mean all of written revelation, including the later books of the Hebrew Bible, which is more popularly called the Tanakh as a compilation. And the rabbis also come up with an idea, which we'll talk about in a future class, called the Oral Torah, that there's a written Torah of the first 5 books, but there's also, according to the rabbis, an oral Torah of commentary, discussion, interpretation that has the same force of revelation as Sinai, but is received over time as you interpret the text. It's how to interpret the text and what you get from interpreting the text. That too can be Torah. So when you hear a modern Orthodox or even an ultra-Orthodox Jew today saying they're living a Torah lifestyle, they're not doing what that writer did when he lived by the laws of the Hebrew Bible in that book called The Year of Living Biblically. They're not literalists living that way. They're living by the written Torah and the rabbinic interpretation called the Oral Torah in conjunction with it. They're really living by the Talmud or the law codes that came out of the Talmud. That's really what they're living by. They're not living just by those first 5 books. All right. So where does this collection come from? Any book we get, we might ask who wrote this, when did they write it, and why? As I mentioned, there's more detail on the history in our other class, but traditionally the concept was, according to the rabbis, that Moses received the entire Torah on Sinai. And there were even some rabbis that pointed out there might be some problems with this. By the Middle Ages, Ibn Ezra, for example, notices that Moses claims to be the most humble man who ever lived, which is unlikely to come out of the mouth of the humblest man who ever lived, to be bragging like that. It also mentions at the end of Deuteronomy that Moses dies and he was honored, and there's never been a prophet since Moses as good as he was, and no one knows where he was buried. And the Jewish people mourned for 30 days. And it's not like Moses wrote that either. Again, this is our modern mentality. The rabbis imagined that Moses actually had to write those and was crying because he was reading about his own death. Prophecy is real if you believe it. So there's no problem with Moses writing those. But again, that's the traditional conception of it. Now, our approach is a little bit different, and I'll give you just a quick overview of this. Again, it's going to help us in talking about specific texts. So This is an example of an approach to this subject called higher criticism. Lower criticism is actually talking about what are the actual words and letters that are the proper text of the Hebrew Bible, because all the old manuscripts don't always agree on exactly how words should be spelled or not. So there's a whole school of criticism that investigates all the manuscripts to figure out exactly what the correct spelling was or where it branched off and why it changed and so on. We're not going to deal with that today. Higher criticism is sort of a step above that, and it's imagining, well, when was this written, and more importantly, why was this written? How was it put together? And certainly there are plenty of challenges to the biblical account. I mean, if you study geology, the earth isn't as old. The earth is much older, rather, than what the Hebrew Bible or the Jewish tradition would claim. Archaeology doesn't always agree with the order of events or even the numbers of peoples involved. I mean, according to the Hebrew Bible, 600,000 men and however many women and children they didn't count were part of the Exodus from Egypt. Well, you think they would have broken some pots or left an outhouse on the way. I mean, there would be evidence of that many people moving, which, by the way, would have been like 10% of the world population at the time, as it claimed, or at least the regional population. So in any case, there are a lot of archaeological challenges to the Hebrew Bible. We also see some of the evolution of Hebrew language based on pottery and inscriptions that we found by digging in the soil that represent the evolution of Hebrew language and shows that some parts of the Hebrew Bible are older than other parts and some parts are more recent. We've also, by the way, dug up other cultures, and we found a Babylonian version of a flood story that predates the Hebrew Bible text by many centuries. And also an example, for example, the king Sargon of the Akkadians was the child of a goddess and immortal, and so she couldn't keep him, so she put him in a basket and left it on the river, and then he was adopted by a princess. Where have I heard that story before? Okay, it's Moses in the water on Passover, right? So finding these earlier examples of these stories began to challenge people's faith that this is a pure revelation to the Hebrew people, when these other peoples have very similar studies and very similar texts and processes. So the basic idea that came out of a long process of study, and there's some argumentation even about it even today, but it's still the dominant theory in the academy, is that when you look at the different names for God and the different styles of narrative and the different locations that are emphasized, and the fact that some stories are repeated with a different name of God or a different hero doing it, that you can find some cases where they begin to line up in patterns. And so this was an attempt to describe the pattern originally presented by Julius Wellhausen in the late 1800s. It's been modified over time. And it's called the documentary hypothesis. So in very brief, there are thought to be 4 documents that come together to make the Hebrew Bible. You've got J, named for Yahweh. Again, if you wrote Yud He Vav He, that 4-letter name for God, in German, it'd be with a J for the Y sound. We would use a Y for Yud in the Hebrew. And so it was called the J document because it focused on the kingdom of Judah and also that Hebrew name for God as Yud He Vav He. It's a much more literary style creation. Narrative, for example, in chapter 3, it's more for the folklore, and so that's why it was dated somewhat earlier. There's also thought of an E document because it refers to God as Elohim, which is often translated as just God, although if you notice the Hebrew pattern, Im at the end often means plural, so it could mean the gods at one time. We'll see an example of a text that complicates that. And it generally focuses on the northern part of the Hebrew territories, especially the tribe of Ephraim, again with an E, also more literary. And then there's a thought that at a certain point, maybe around the destruction of the northern kingdom, that refugees came south and J and E were combined into J-E. So sometimes you have the God name Yahweh Elohim as a double name. There's also 2 other documents or editorial strands. One is the document called D, named for Deuteronomy, which is thought to be primarily contained in that book, although it has an editorial style that continued even after the end of the Torah. And it's dated to the reforms of King Josiah around 620 BCE, because those reforms match a lot of the prohibitions and the rhetoric that appears in Deuteronomy. And then the last strand originally proposed was that there was a P, or a priestly editorial strand, that sort of put everything together, focuses primarily on priestly rituals, and adds in things where it needs to make it more focused on priestly rituals and purity issues. So as one example, you'll find some texts where it seems almost obvious that Moses is talking to Pharaoh or Moses is doing something, and then they've added an "and Aaron" in there because Aaron is the ancestor of the priest. So they want Aaron to be at every major event, like Zelig, in that Woody Allen movie. But in this case, it's part of an editorial strand that's re-emphasizing the importance of priests. And again, as I mentioned, you have the divine names, repeating the narratives, what the ideological focus is that can help point out some of these divisions. And we'll take a look in a little bit at Genesis chapter 1 and 2 to see some examples of that. Now, what I wanted to give you as an overview before we look at those specific stories are 4 different ways that humanistic Jews in general can approach the question of how we deal with the Torah. And I did a presentation for our congregation in Toronto some years, it feels like years ago, it was only maybe last year, on our approach to Torah called Our Torah. And again, I'll put a link in the description of the video below. But basically, there are 4 lenses through which we view the text: as myth, as history, as ethics or values, and as literature. So if we think of this as a myth, these are our origin stories. These are events that were claimed to have happened, but are not supported by archaeology or by internal consistency. There was no creation. There was no global flood. There's no evidence of that in any of the geology that we find. There were regional floods for sure, but no global flood. Plus, honestly, how would the kangaroos have made it all the way to the Ark? I mean, that's an interesting challenge. Now, just because we say it's a myth doesn't mean it's meaningless or useful. It's not just a myth. I never say just a myth, because myths are really important and powerful. I mean, we've seen in the last 5 years in American politics how what people believe is more important than what is. Okay, so myths are very important, and they can still have power because they articulate what you might call poetic truths of the human experience. The best of the Greek myths or Hebrew myths say something profound about what it means to be human or what it means to be, living in this world. In Genesis chapter 2, where Adam is created, and then God sees that there's no one really fit to match with him, and it says in the text, "Lo tov Adam hayot levado." It is not good for a person to be alone. That's just true. If nothing else, the last 2 years have taught us it is not good for people to be alone. We need other people, and that's a truth of the human experience that goes back to whoever wrote that, whenever they wrote it, and carries through to today. So I want to be literate in my people's stories, even if I don't think they're facts. Why would I know all those Greek myths and not know the Hebrew myths? That would be, not understanding, not getting the jokes, not understanding the references that are part of all of Jewish culture since this was written, right? They're always turning back to these stories. I should know these stories. So myth is one level. Second level is as history. Again, this is not a place to go for reliable facts of what happened that it's describing, but sometimes you can use it as evidence for when it was written. So there's a famous story of Lot and his daughters. Remember, Lot is rescued from Sodom and Gomorrah when they're destroyed for their sin. His wife looks back, it turns into a pillar of salt, and he and his daughters take refuge in a cave. And the daughters get him drunk and sleep with him because they think everything's been destroyed in the world and they have to repopulate, and they produce 2 children. One is named Ben Ami, which becomes the ancestor of the Ammonites, and the other is Moab, literally from my father, and that becomes the ancestor of the Moabites. Now, I will guarantee you that the Ammonites and Moabites did not tell that story about themselves. Because why would you tell a story about yourself that you're the child of incest? This is a story that was told by the Hebrews about the Ammonites and the Moabites at a later time when they were rivals and actually fighting wars with each other, to say those people are bastards, and they've been bastards forever. So it's a political narrative. It's not a real history. It's telling you about when it was written and not what it was claiming to describe. Or another example, as the Torah is being, sort of finalized and put together, there's a major rivalry between the priests and the prophets. The prophets claim that they get direct word from Yahweh all the time. Hear the word of the Lord, right? The priests want things to run according to an order and a system. And they believe they've gotten the best prophecy ever from the best prophet ever. Remember, there's no one like Moses ever since Moses. Well, if they have the best prophecy ever written down in a book, and in fact, the book itself says if a new prophet shows up, check what they say against the book and see if it agrees, because if it doesn't, they're out. Now you don't need prophets anymore. Bye-bye, prophets. Go away. I think of the flight attendant in Saturday Night Live sketch. Bye-bye, right? Go away. So it's a political maneuvering, right? To say Moses is the best of all prophets because he dies, nobody knows where he's buried, and guess who's left in charge? Aaron's grandson Zadok, who's the ancestor of the Zadokite priesthood. And they have all the rules. We'll see some of those priestly rules. They got all the rules for all the sacrifices and how important the priests are. It's all written down. So don't need prophets anymore. Again, political agendas telling us about when it was written, but not necessarily what it claims to describe. And it helps us understand the context. If you don't know that Shakespeare lived in Elizabethan England, you could still read his plays and you could still get something out of it. But I think knowing when he wrote it and what was going on around him adds something. It's another layer. You don't have to only think about that, but it's an important layer to understand when you're reading his work. Okay, so that was myth, that's history. Now ethics and values. Fortunately for us as humanistic Jews, this is a book written by people, which means they had some insight and they had some mishigas, silliness, and sometimes they were a product of their time, which means sometimes they were wonderful and sometimes it was what we would consider backwards. You know, are commandments ethical to perform? Well, we ask different questions. Back then, the idea of having the God telling you what to do as the definition of righteousness made sense because the commander had authority. You were afraid he was going to punish you or reward you if you didn't follow or followed them. And he had infinite power to do this. And there was a sense that it was better to just follow the rules. There's a virtue to just doing what you're told. They didn't do the analysis of how will this turn out? What are the consequences of this decision? Is honoring my mother and father going to make me happy or not? That wasn't part of the calculus. It was following the authority. Now, we might decide from an evolutionary standpoint, it's good to honor your parents, certainly until you're, able to leave the house. But even more important, some of these laws we might decide are no longer relevant to us. Laws banning male homosexuality, for example, or laws allowing slavery, we might find very objectionable. Even if it modified slavery in its time period, it's still allowing slavery. And it's certainly allowing a different level of slavery for Hebrew slaves and for non-Hebrew slaves whom you can keep forever, including giving them as property bequeathed to your children, okay? This is a kind of chattel slavery for non-Jewish slaves. So again, we're allowed to say we have a problem with that because this was written by people. It's not timeless law we have to justify, it's time-bound law that we are allowed to agree with or disagree with. And that's why I described our values and Torah values as kind of a Venn diagram. There are some cases we agree. As we'll see examples of laws that do that, where we say, wow, what a great law, how progressive of them to think of that, how advanced for their time. But there are other cases where we're allowed to say, we either find this irrelevant or we object to this because it simply does not meet our morals today. And then finally, you can think about it as literature, as we're going to be exploring it in this class. It's the origin story for the Hebrew nation, where the tribes came from, where the places they lived in came from, where the rituals came from, where the temple came from, where the sacrificial cult came from. It was explaining all these origins. And God is a character in the stories. Again, if it's a story and it's a myth, if Zeus is a character, then the Hebrew God Yahweh is a character too. And sometimes he acts like a character. I mean, there's a famous story where they've built the golden calf to worship that instead. And he says to Moses, do you see what your people have done? It's like when parents are mad at each other, and they say, you know what your son has done? So he says, you see what your people have done, Moses? I'm going to wipe them out and start over with you. And Moses becomes like the anger management therapist, where he has to calm him down and motivate him to behave better. And so he says, well, you could wipe them out if you want to, but then everybody else will say you were too weak to bring them in. So now he's bringing shame into it. And after all, you did promise them by your own name that you would bring them in. And you really love their ancestors. So even if you don't like them, maybe for the sake of their, patriarchs that you promised them, maybe you should do it. And he also says, don't forget they're your people too. He turns the pronoun back and says, they're your people. Don't do this to your people. And so finally God says, all right, fine. I won't wipe them out. But again, if you're seeing this as the cosmic God of the universe, what's going on here? God gets mad. God regrets things. No, he's a character in the story. Then it makes a lot more sense and actually makes it more interesting. You know, you see God's character development. You wouldn't think of that in a conventional setting, but as literature, it makes a lot of sense. And this becomes the basis for future Jewish literature. You can't understand medieval Jewish poetry or modern Jewish literature and narrative if you don't read these stories, if you don't understand the characters, the motifs, the themes, the issues, the language that's used. You know, later poetry, later songs, modern Hebrew songbook is rife with these references. And you're just going to miss it if you don't know some of the stories. And the other thing that makes it fascinating to read it as literature is a concept that modern literary theory has called intertextuality. And in very brief, it basically means that when I write something new based on something old, it changes both of them. So if I write a new poem and I include the line, it is not good for people to be alone, I'm clearly referencing the Genesis story. So you can sort of bring in some of the baggage and the emotional attachments and the themes of that story into the modern piece that I've written. But the next time you read the Genesis story, when you read that line, you might think of my piece that I wrote now. And so some of those ideas get imported into the original source. So this intertextuality is a two-way street of new literature commenting on what's old, but also the old adding some resonance to what's new. So this is why knowing these stories is valuable. Now, I will say, if you try to read the Torah from Genesis 1 to the end of Deuteronomy, there are some parts that drag. It's not, necessarily I would say page turner, except on a scroll, a page roller, I guess you would call it. So here's an example of what a literary agent might say if they had received this manuscript and had to, recommend it. You have some issues with consistency. Sometimes your Yahweh loves the Israelites and sometimes he hates them and they can't stick to anything either. Worship one God, worship many gods, golden calf, no idols, what's going on here? The whole Exodus sequence is way too deus ex machina and rather implausible. Cut down on the sections on leprosy and impurity, those genealogies, the genealogies that just don't go anywhere, and cut out all the repetitions. All right, we get it. I'm a jealous God. Don't worship any other gods. Don't look at any other gods, blah, blah, blah. The legal sections have some interesting potential, but they're way too pushy. How about the 10 suggestions instead? And finally, ending with Moses' death is a real downer. Maybe he comes back for a surprise cameo in the sequel. So as literature, again, it's been studied and restudied and restudied, and there are certainly narratives that are tremendously powerful. But because it's been treated as written by God, because it's been such an object of central study in Jewish culture over centuries, people treat it as if it is gold when it is made by people. And so some parts of it are beautiful and some parts of it are challenging. Just like I wouldn't assume that everything's perfect in Shakespeare either. If there even was one Shakespeare and not many Shakespeares that were compiled ultimately into what we now call Shakespeare, just like the Torah, right? Could be many Shakespeares into one. This is the reality of inherited culture. And Shakespeare lived a lot more recently than the Torah was put together. So this is an overview of our approach to Torah as a concept. And now we're going to look at some specific texts and talk about those as examples. And this, by the way, covers more or less the discussion questions that are part of the curriculum. In previous classes, because we were going a little bit faster, a little bit slower than the curriculum does, we were doing separate sessions for each holiday and separate sessions for the individual life cycle events. The discussion questions in the course packet didn't necessarily match, but now as we're getting into the Torah, Tanakh, other literature, we are going to follow it more directly. In this case, the discussion questions are simply looking at primary sources, which we'll talk about in a minute. So I don't have to pull up the sheet for you, but it is there.